The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above Oak Creek Memorial's ICU, a sound Brooke Sullivan had learned to filter out 3 years ago the way soldiers learn to sleep through artillery. She stood at the medication cart in the pre-dawn darkness, 2:16 a.m. on a Tuesday in Portland, checking 14-gauge needles against her mental inventory, hands moving with the kind of precision that belonged in an operating theater, not in a hospital corridor where no one watched and no one cared. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the air like a second atmosphere, sharp and bitter enough to coat her mouth. She had become exceptionally good at invisibility. The ICU at Oak Creek Memorial held 12 beds, each one a contained universe of beeping monitors and hissing ventilators and the soft mechanical breathing of people suspended between life and whatever came after. Brooke moved through those universes like a ghost, checking tube placements, adjusting for drips, wiping the foreheads of patients who couldn't wipe their own. She touched their skin, their hair, their hands that trembled with fever all lay still as wax. She held the boundaries between their bodies and the machinery that kept those bodies functioning. 3 years of this. 3 years of being present in rooms where life hung by a thread no thicker than a human hair, and yet somehow always feeling absent from everything else. Her locker was the small metal box on the third shelf from the bottom. She opened it every shift before putting on her scrubs, same ritual, same moment of contact. The boots sat there on a folded towel, worn desert town leather, sand still embedded in the creases, laces that had never quite come clean despite years of trying. She touched them with her fingertips, pressing her palm flat against one of the soles. The leather was cracked like old parchment. She couldn't explain to anyone why she kept them. How could you explain that some objects held your own breath inside them? She closed the locker without a sound. The break room would fill in 2 hours. She knew the schedule the way she knew her own heartbeat. Martinez arrived at 5 a.m. with her terrible coffee from the drive-thru. Chen came at 5:15, already complaining about night shift. Williams and Patterson rolled in together around 5:30, their laughter arriving before they did, the kind of easy, boneless laughter that belonged to people who didn't carry anything heavier than regular exhaustion. They had welcomed Brooke on her first day 3 years ago. They had asked her questions. They had invited her to happy hours and baby showers and birthday celebrations that happened in the break room while she organized supplies in the supply closet. That had lasted approximately 6 weeks. Now, when Brooke entered the break room, conversations paused. Phones suddenly required attention. Someone needed to check on a patient in Bay 7. It wasn't angry or loud, if anything, it was worse for the simple quietness of it. It was the sound of people deciding, collectively and without discussion, that someone did not belong. She had seen it happen in military barracks too, though the mechanics were different there. Here, it was polite. Here, it was the kind of exclusion that left no bruises. She did her morning rounds before the day shift arrived. Checking pupils, assessing skin color, reading the monitors for the tells that separated stable patients from those teetering toward the edge. The work was precise and repetitive, and it required nothing from her except her hands and her attention. She had learned long ago that she was good at work that required nothing else. At 6:27 a.m., the automatic doors hissed open and Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered the ICU like a man who owned it. Hargrove was tall in the way wealthy people often were, as if good nutrition and regular tennis had built him from better materials than ordinary humans. His badge identified him as Chief of Emergency Medicine. His bearing identified him as someone who had never once questioned whether he deserved that title. He moved through the ICU with a coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other, stopping at each bed with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 15 years and had run out of patients approximately 14 years ago. Martinez, check Bay 3's lights. Chen, I want a full neuro panel on Bay 9 before rounds. He didn't consult the chart. He simply said it, and the thing happened, because that was how authority worked when you had it. Williams, the family in Bay 6 needs to understand that we're looking at palliative care here. Williams. You understand? Understood, Dr. Hargrove. Williams answered. Williams was acknowledged. Williams existed. He reached Bay 11, where Brooke was adjusting the full line of a 64-year-old man who had been bleeding into his own abdomen for 4 hours before anyone thought to bring him in. The patient's eyes were open but distant, sedated to the point where pain was theoretical rather than actual. His wife had left at midnight, promising to return in 6 hours with their daughter. Brooke had the chest tube already placed, the line running clear, the medications going in on schedule. Everything that needed to be done was being done. "You," Hargrove said. "Is this patient on the 2-unit protocol?" "Just you." Not even a glance at her name badge, though it was pinned at chest level in letters large enough to read from across the room. "Just you," the way you might say it to someone holding an elevator door. 2 units of PRBC started 45 minutes ago, doctor. I'm monitoring for transfusion reaction. Vital stable. O2 sat holding at 94. Her voice came out even, correct, the voice of someone delivering information. The voice of someone who did not exist except as a function. Urine output decreased to 15 cubic centimeters per hour. Lab work pending. Hargrove glanced at the monitor once. "Good. Don't mess with it," he said, and then he was gone, moving to the next bed, the next chart, the next universe of small suffering that required his attention for exactly 90 seconds before moving on to the next one. Not bad work. He was competent. Hargrove was good at his job. This was perhaps the problem. At 7:32 a.m., a trauma surgeon came through the unit, someone visiting from Seattle General, someone on a clinical exchange who had no reason to be in Portland except that he wanted to observe crisis medicine in different settings. His name was Dr. Clayton Reeves. He was younger than Hargrove by maybe a decade, leaner in the way of people who still remembered what it felt like to run operations rather than just order them. He wore a Navy insignia on his ID badge. Just small enough to miss if you weren't looking. He stopped at Bay 11. He watched Brooke adjust the chest tube. The tube had started to drift, nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, but the kind of thing that happened when patients moved in their sedation and gravity and physics did what they always did. She had caught it on a routine check. She was already threading the fresh line, using a technique called a Kandahar splice, a way of securing the line that kept it from slipping and also made sure the drainage stayed clear. It wasn't common. It wasn't something they taught in most nursing programs. It was something you learned when you worked in a trauma bay where the electricity went out sometimes and you had to improvise, where the standard methods didn't hold up under the specific pressures of the specific environment. She felt him watching. She didn't stop. She finished the splice, secured the line, checked the drainage flow. Professional. Clean. The kind of work that spoke for itself to people who understood what they were looking at. "That's a Kandahar splice," Dr. Reeves said. His voice was quiet. "Where do you serve?" The room didn't change. The monitors kept their rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath. But something in the air shifted, the way air shifts before a storm, pressure dropping, everything waiting. Brooke's hand steadied. She had trained for 38 seconds of silence under fire. She could manage whatever came next. "I didn't," she said. It wasn't true. It was the kind of answer that closed conversations. It was the kind of answer that told people not to ask follow-up questions. Dr. Reeves studied her for another moment. She didn't raise her eyes. She kept her attention on the line, on the drainage, on the patient. On the work. One tear slid down her cheek, just one, just on the left side, just enough to be real, and she wiped it away without breaking her focus, without breaking her breath, without giving him anything except the bare fact that something inside her had moved. He didn't push. She was grateful for that. At 8:15 a.m., Brooke went to check the unit board. The board held the shift assignments, the critical alerts, the notes about which patients needed what. It also held something new, a formal write-up, printed on hospital letterhead, dated this morning. Her name was on it. Her shifts were on it. The date and time of the incident were on it. The accusation was on it too, in Hargrove's precise handwriting, questioning physician authority and undermining team morale. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood. She had asked him a question yesterday during rounds. A patient in Bay 4 was showing signs of septic shock, and the standard protocol was a 3-liter fluid challenge before considering vasopressors. Hargrove had ordered vasopressors first. She had said, "Doctor, should we run fluids first?" That was all. That was the entire conversation. One question. A question that was, in fact, correct. The protocol was fluids first. The patient had improved with fluids alone. No vasopressors needed. That was her crime. Asking. She took the write-up off the board because someone had to. Because it was still there. Because taking it down and folding it was something her hands could do while her chest did what it was doing. She folded it once, then again. The paper crinkled. It sounded loud in the empty hallway. The break room was full when she walked past. All 4 of them were there, Martinez and Chen and Williams and Patterson, and they were doing what they did every morning. They were laughing about something on someone's phone. They were talking about the night shift. They were existing in that space of easy human connection that Brooke had been permitted to inhabit for 6 weeks and then never again. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. But she watched, and she saw the moment one of them noticed her. Saw them see her see them. Saw the way their conversation shifted without any of them actually moving. Martinez stood up. Chen started gathering her belongings. William said something Brooke couldn't hear, and Patterson stood up too. All 4 of them picked up their things and moved to a different table, the one by the far window, the one furthest from where Brooke stood in the doorway. Nobody said anything. Nobody looked directly at her. They just moved, the way a flock of birds moves when a predator appears, not panicked, not angry, just the simple biological imperative to create distance. The message was clear enough. The work in the ICU had to happen, and Brooke could do the work, but the rest of it, the belonging, the laughter, the small human moments that made the work bearable, that was not for her. The thing that nobody understood about 3 years of invisibility was that it became a kind of armor. It meant no one was watching closely enough to notice what you could do. It meant you could work without being scrutinized. It meant you were already alone, so there was nothing left to lose. At 9:03 a.m., the ICU intercom crackled to life. Code incoming. Trauma alert. Multiple systems failure. ETA 8 minutes. All available staff stand by. Brooke heard it the way she heard everything else, registered it, processed it, moved toward the preparation bay. The work was coming. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. She didn't know yet that the patient would be a colonel from Ramadi. She didn't know yet that his name was a call sign she would recognize. She didn't know yet that the next person to address her by her actual rank would be someone wearing Navy dress uniform, or that the boots in her locker would finally matter again, or that true class, the kind that mattered, was what you did when the entire world had stopped watching and you chose to give anyway. All she knew was that the fluorescent lights hummed above her head, and there was work to do, and her hands knew how to do it. Everything else would come later. The colonel arrived at 0400 on a Wednesday, airlifted from Ramadi with a body that had given up the fight before his mind caught up. Multi-organ failure. Septic shock. The kind of damage that doesn't announce itself gently. His family was already in the ICU room when Brooke arrived for her shift, a daughter with her father's jawline, a son in army dress uniform, a wife whose hands trembled as they gripped the bed rail. Brooke had seen this composition before. She knew the ending they were walking toward. Dr. Hargrove entered at 0430 with 2 attending physicians flanking him like remoras following a shark. He didn't look at the monitors. He looked at his watch. The daughter stepped forward immediately, hope still flickering in her eyes like a candle not yet snuffed. "Doctor, what's his prognosis? Can he recover?" Hargrove set his tablet on the bedside table with the deliberate precision of someone who enjoyed delivering verdicts. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had never been questioned. "Your father's kidneys have failed. His liver is necrotic. His immune system has already surrendered. Heroic measures would be futile. More than futile, they would be cruel." He paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle. "We can keep him comfortable. That's all we can offer now." The son in uniform stiffened. The wife made a sound like a wounded animal trying not to scream. The daughter's face went pale, then red, then the kind of white that comes from understanding that the next 48 hours exist only in hospital rooms and goodbye conversations. Hargrove turned to Brooke. She stood at the foot of the bed, her hand steady, her face composed in the way she had learned to compose it 3 years ago when she realized composure was the only armor that still fit. "I trust even you can manage comfort care without supervision," he said, the words layered with contempt so obvious that the attending physicians made small choking sounds that turned into coughs. One smiled. Another looked at his shoes. Hargrove continued as if he had complimented her. "Morphine as needed. Keep him dry. Monitor his output. Call me if he coded, though I suppose we both know that won't be an issue." Brooke took one measured breath. She did not look at Hargrove. She looked at the colonel's daughter, whose chin was trembling, and at the son in uniform, whose hands had clenched into fists. She looked at the wife, who had closed her eyes as if she could unsee the last 5 minutes if she just didn't look at anything else. Then she looked at the colonel himself, unconscious, tubes threaded through his nose and mouth, his chest rising and falling in rhythms the ventilator dictated, not his own body. She wiped a single tear that had escaped without permission, wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, and said only, "I'll stay with him." The attending physicians left first, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Hargrove lingered for one more moment, adjusting his stethoscope around his neck like a general arranging his medals. "Adequate hands," he said softly, just to himself. Then he was gone, and Brooke was alone with a dying man and his family and the weight of every moment she had never been good enough. That afternoon in the break room, Brooke sat at the small table by the window with a salad she had no appetite for. 3 other nurses came in together, talking in the animated way people talk when they want everyone to hear them. One gathered her jacket. Another collected her phone. The third made a show of checking the schedule, then announced she was switching tables. They moved to the far corner without a word to Brooke, their silence more eloquent than screaming. One whispered loudly enough to carry, "Did you see how she questioned the chest tube placement this morning? Like she thinks she knows better than Dr. Hargrove." Another responded, voice thick with contempt, "She thinks she's a doctor. She's a nurse with delusions." Brooke did not look up from her salad. She had learned not to look up. Looking up meant engaging. Engaging meant defending. Defending meant confirming everything they were saying. Instead, she chewed food that tasted like plastic and listened to them dissect her in the casual way predators pick at prey. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their electronic hymn. Rain began hammering against the window in staccato bursts, each drop hitting the glass like a tiny accusation. By noon, a formal write-up had been posted on the unit board visible to all staff and families moving through the ICU. Brooke's name was there, printed in Hargrove's precise handwriting. Questioning physician authority. Undermining team morale. Practicing outside her scope of licensure. The charges were vague enough to mean everything and nothing. She stood in front of the board for exactly 10 seconds, reading it the way a condemned person reads their sentence, then walked away. It was while she was adjusting the colonel's chest tube, a procedure Hargrove had deemed futile, a procedure nobody was asking her to perform, that Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. He was young, late 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that came from actually caring about the work. He watched her hands move with the precision of someone threading a needle in a sandstorm, hands that knew every micromillimeter of space, hands that didn't hesitate or second-guess. He waited until she finished, then stepped closer. "That's a Kandahar splice," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was recognition, the way one veteran recognizes another across crowded rooms. "Where do you serve?" The question hung in the sterile air between them. Brooke met his eyes with quiet dignity, let one tear slide down her cheek, wiped it away without breaking his gaze, and said only, "I didn't." She turned back to her work, her movements precise as surgical instruments clicking into place, and Dr. Chen stood in the doorway for a long moment, his expression shifting from suspicion to something much more complicated, something that looked almost like reverence. By 0200, the colonel's monitors began screaming. The alarms cut through the ICU like chainsaw blades, high-pitched, insistent, impossible to ignore. Brooke ran to his bedside immediately and knew before the monitor even fully displayed the data. Muffled heart sounds. Plummeting blood pressure. The characteristic pattern of blood pooling where it had no right to be. Pericardial effusion. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of emergency that kills quietly if you don't know what you're looking at. She paged Hargrove from the on-call room and began her assessment while waiting for him to shuffle into the unit with sleep still heavy in his eyes. She examined the colonel with the focused intensity of someone who had performed this procedure on patients whose blood pressure was measured not in millimeters of mercury but in how long until the patient was dead. Her hands moved without hesitation. She gathered supplies, drew bloods, prepared for what had to come next. Hargrove arrived disheveled, his white coat unbuttoned, his hair mussed from the pillow. He took one look at the monitor and made his decision in less than 3 seconds. His DNR adjacent, Hargrove announced to no one in particular. Let him go peacefully. I'm not authorizing invasive procedures for a terminal patient at this hour. He turned toward the exit as if the conversation had concluded, as if his pronouncement had been inscribed in stone. Brooke's voice came out quiet, steady as a laser. His pericardial sac is filling with blood. Pericardiocentesis could save him. Hargrove's face went from sleep flush to crimson in 3 heartbeats. You're a nurse, not a physician. Your job is to follow orders, not practice medicine. This conversation is finished. He began walking toward the door, his footsteps sharp against the tile. Brooke looked at the colonel's face. She looked at his daughter, who had stayed the entire day in the chair beside his bed, reading to him even though his ears might not be working. She looked at the break room window, where the pair of worn combat boots sat in her locker, visible under the fluorescent light, waiting like a choice she hadn't made yet. Then she made it. She walked to the ICU door and locked it from the inside. The click of the mechanism engaging sounded like a door slamming in a cathedral. Hargrove realized what was happening and came back immediately, his face transforming from confusion to rage. He pounded on the glass partition, the impacts echoing through the unit like gunshots. Open this door. You're finished. Do you hear me? Finished. Your license. Your career. The words dissolved into inarticulate fury, muffled by the glass but unmistakable in their venom. His colleagues stared. 2 nurses froze mid-stride. 1 family member in an adjacent room sat up in alarm. Dr. Chen appeared at the chaos, drawn by the commotion. He watched through the window with widening eyes as Brooke prepped the sterile field for emergency pericardiocentesis, her movement smooth and efficient as a dancer performing a piece she had memorized decades ago. She did not look at Hargrove. She did not acknowledge the pounding on the glass or the screaming or the career imploding behind her like a building collapsing in slow motion. She worked. That was all. At 0200 the alarms stopped being warnings and became screams. The colonel's heart monitor showed the muffled heart sounds, that distant thudding like a fist pounding from inside a locked box. Blood pressure collapsing. 74. 68. 59. The numbers fell like stones down a well with no bottom. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart itself, suffocating it from the inside. Brooke moved before the second alarm fired. 2 steps to the bedside. Her hands already moving, no hesitation, no calculation. This was muscle memory worn smooth by sandstorms and medevac helicopters and the particular kind of clarity that only comes when you've already died once and decided not to do it again. She was reading the monitor like a combat medic reads terrain. The data was there. It was always there. You just had to know how to listen. The phone rang in Hargrove's on-call room at 0203. It took him for minutes to shuffle down to the trauma bay, his hair sticking up on one side, his lab coat buttoned wrong. He looked at the monitor. Just looked. For 3 full seconds he studied the vital signs and the desperate landscape of numbers, and then he said the words that would end him. His DNR adjacent. Let him go peacefully. Brooke didn't pause. Her hands were already positioned at the colonel's subxiphoid angle, that shallow dip just below where the ribs met. The needle was in her other hand. A 16-gauge for catheter over a long needle, the kind they teach in trauma courses but most civilian doctors never actually use because they're waiting for the crash cart to arrive, for someone else to move, for protocol to take hold and direct them. Brooke wasn't waiting. She never waited. "Step back, doctor." "Excuse me." I said step back. The composure in her voice didn't match the hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in field hospitals under mortar fire, who understood that hesitation was death wearing a different uniform. Hargrove's face went the color of old brick. He opened his mouth to speak, to command, to reassert the hierarchy that said an ICU nurse did not perform physician-level procedures, but something in the set of Brooke's shoulders made him step back instead. He stepped back. Then his face shifted. The rage transformed into something colder, calculation. He turned and walked toward the door. Locked the door from the outside, but he was already reaching for his phone, already dialing the hospital board president's personal line, already crafting the words that would transform her mercy into her crime. The needle advanced through the pericardial sac with a distinctive give, resistance then release, like pushing through fabric. That single moment told her everything. The angle was right. The depth was right. Her breath steadied. She pulled back on the plunger and the syringe filled with dark red blood. 100 cc. 150. 200. The viscous fluid that had been suffocating the colonel's heart now flowed into the syringe like a confession. The monitor changed. That was the thing about saving a life in the middle of the night, it announced itself. The muffled heart sounds sharpened into that crisp, clean double beat. The blood pressure climbed. 70. 80. 85. The colonel's oxygen saturation rose from 78 to 88 to 94 in the space of 4 breaths. His pupils constricted. His eyelids fluttered. Dr. Chen, the trauma surgeon who'd recognized the Kandahar splice in the colonel's chest tube 3 days earlier, stood at the window watching. He'd seen combat medicine in textbooks and grand rounds presentations, but he'd never seen it performed with this kind of terrifying, perfect competence. This kind of economy. This was the difference between knowing a procedure and being one, between understanding the steps and having your nervous system understand them so completely that your hands moved without waiting for your brain to catch up. Hargrove was still outside the locked door, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, sir, I understand the hour. This is urgent. We have a rogue nurse performing physician-level interventions, performing pericardiocentesis without supervision, without physician authorization." "Yes. I'll hold." The board president was awake now. So was the state nursing board investigator by 02:30, answering his phone in a hotel room 6 blocks from the hospital, listening to Hargrove's carefully constructed narrative about protocol violations and dangerous deviations and a nurse who'd overstepped her authority in a way that endangered the patient. Hargrove knew exactly what he was doing. He accessed her employment file, took him 90 seconds on the hospital system, and found the reference that didn't belong, the VA clinic 3 states away that she deliberately omitted from her official resume. One phone call at 0247. One careful question about any history of protocol violations. The clinic administrator was half asleep, but the accusatory framing made them cautious. "I'd need to consult with our legal team before I could comment on any former staff," he said, which was a confirmation all by itself. The omission alone would raise flags. The omission combined with Hargrove's insinuation would build a case. By 0400, Hargrove had called 3 more references, had filed a preliminary complaint with the state board, and had documented everything with the precision of a man building scaffolding for her to hang from. In the trauma bay, Brooke was cleaning. That was what she did after she saved lives, she cleaned. The syringe went into the biohazard container. The needle into the sharps bin. Gloves snapped off with that distinctive sound like small-caliber gunshots in the quiet hospital. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She'd learned decades ago that the aftermath was when soldiers fell apart, when they realized what they'd just done, and she simply chose not to fall apart. The colonel opened his eyes. Not a flutter. Not a reflex. Open. Present. Looking directly at his daughter, who'd been sitting in the corner for 6 hours, and he said her name. Just her name. Sarah. His daughter stood up so fast her chair scraped backward across the tile with a sound like a scream. She moved to the bedside and took his hand, the hand that had been cold as corpse for the last 72 hours, and now it was warm. Warm and responsive and holding her hand back with enough pressure to mean something. You saved him, she whispered to Brooke. Not a question. A statement. The absolute certainty of someone who'd watched her father die and then watched him come back. Brooke had already turned toward the supply cabinet, already moving on to the next task. I just did what needed doing. It was a small sentence. A nothing sentence. The kind of sentence that wouldn't appear in any report, that wouldn't register on any official record. It was the sentence of someone who understood that the work itself was the point, that the recognition would never come, that the gratitude belonged to God and medicine and muscle memory forged in places she would never speak about. The door opened at 0815. Not gently. Hargrove entered with 2 security officers and a woman in a state nursing board investigator's blazer, and he was smiling. Not the smile of someone who'd been up all night. The smile of someone who'd been making phone calls all night. The smile of someone who'd built something during the darkness and was now ready to unveil it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, he said, and the way he spoke those words, each syllable deliberately enunciated, told her everything. He knew. He'd pieced it together. But that wasn't going to matter, because he'd already moved past knowing into the machinery of destroying. You're under investigation for dangerous deviations from protocol. Your license is temporarily suspended, pending a full hearing. These officers will escort you from the building. The rain outside started without warning, hammering the hospital windows like fists demanding entry. Brooke looked at the colonel, who was breathing on his own, whose heart was beating its own rhythm, whose daughter was holding his hand. She looked at the monitors. Steady vitals. Stable sinus rhythm. Alive. Then she looked at Hargrove, and something shifted in her face. Not anger. Anger required hope that the person deserved your emotion. This was something colder. This was the look of someone who'd just made a strategic calculation and found that mercy was not the same as weakness. She held out her wrists, one crossed over the other, and said, "Lead the way." By the time sunrise cracked over Portland, Dr. Hargrove had already made 7 calls. The hospital board president picked up at 6:15. Then the VA clinic in Sacramento, the one Brooke had deliberately omitted from her resume 3 years ago. Then the state nursing board. By 8, an investigator named Patricia Voss arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a leather folder and the kind of institutional authority that made nurses whisper in hallways. She was here to document dangerous deviations from protocol. She was here to build a case. The board president watched the cardiac monitor display in the colonel's room. 62 beats per minute. Stable. The pericardiocentesis had worked. The blood pressure held at 112/70. The man should have been dead at 0200. Instead, he was breathing on his own, extubated, asking for water. None of that mattered to Dr. Hargrove, who sat in the investigator's office at 9:30 with a stack of documentation that looked like a building permit for destruction. Unauthorized procedures. Insubordination. Falsified credentials, the missing reference she'd conveniently left blank on her application. But the final document, the one he slid across the desk last, was typed in Hargrove's careful handwriting, the history of PTSD-related incidents that she concealed from this institution. Brooke stood in the ICU hallway when the investigator approached her at 10:45. Voss didn't introduce herself. She simply said, "Your personnel file shows a gap in employment. 3 years. Where were you?" "Transitioning out of service," Brooke said. Her voice was level. It was always level. "And you didn't think that was relevant to your medical history." "I was stable. I am stable." Voss's eyes moved across Brooke's face like she was reading subtitles. Dr. Hargrove has documentation suggesting otherwise. He's recommending a full psychological evaluation and a review of your licensure. The room tilted. Not visibly. Not perceptibly to anyone watching. But internally, something shifted, the way a ship's ballast water redistributes when it hits unexpected depth. Brooke's hands were steady. Her jaw tightened by approximately 4 millimeters. Her breathing remained controlled at 16 breaths per minute. But inside, the floor had opened. PTSD. The word hung in the air like something chemical, like something that would poison the water supply of everything she'd built. Because PTSD meant unstable. Unstable meant liability. Liability meant gone. The patient survived, Brooke said quietly. The pericardiocentesis was indicated and successful. According to protocol, it should have been performed by a physician or under direct physician supervision. The physician ordered comfort care. The patient was dying. Which is not your decision to make. Voss closed her folder. There will be a formal review. Do not expect to work this unit pending the outcome. By 11:45, the security guard was in the hallway. His name was Marcus. He'd brought her coffee 3 times a week for 2 years. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Badge, he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The badge hung around her neck on a lanyard. Oak Creek Memorial ICU. Brooke Sullivan, RN. She unclipped it and placed it in his palm without ceremony. The plastic was warm from her body heat. It would be cold by the time anyone else held it. Hargrove watched from his office window as she walked to her car in the parking lot. She carried a small cardboard box containing her belongings, a coffee mug that said nurse in clinical letters, 2 photographs she'd never displayed, a half-eaten package of crackers. Her arms crossed over the box like a parent carrying a sleeping child. Her shoulders were level. Her stride was even. She didn't look up at his window, but she didn't need to. She could feel his satisfaction from the parking lot. That night, she stood in the rain at the Portland Memorial Cemetery where her husband lay beneath a granite stone that read, Marcus Sullivan. Beloved. 1989 to 2019, the rain fell in sheets, the kind of rain that sounds like applause on the windshield of your car but sounds like accusation when it's hitting your skin. She'd brought the boots, the ones from Ramadi, worn at the heels, the laces still stained with dust that never quite washed out. She placed them beside the headstone like an offering to a god she no longer believed in. I tried to disappear like you wanted, she whispered. I tried to be invisible. Just another nurse. Another person nobody remembers at the end of the shift. Her voice cracked, actually cracked, like a transmission grinding into a gear it wasn't meant for. I tried to forget Ramadi and the smoke and the screaming and the way Charlie's intestines looked when the shrapnel went through him. But I failed him. I failed you. I failed everyone. She collapsed to her knees in the mud. Her hands pressed into the wet earth. Her breath came in gasps that she hadn't allowed herself in 3 years, the kind of breathing that came when you finally stopped holding it, when the pretense dissolved and all that remained was the person underneath who'd been drowning the entire time. The rain fell until 2 in the morning. She didn't move. Her son found her at dawn. 17 years old, height still settling into adulthood, eyes that had his father's shape but her mother's relentless intelligence. He was holding something rectangular and black. A shadow box. Inside it, military ribbons were arranged with geometric precision, 2 bronze bars on 1 ribbon, a purple ribbon with its distinctive borders, the navy and gold of a commendation, and beneath them all, a silver star catching the weak morning light like a final accusation. Mom. His voice was careful. Mom, they need to see these. She shook her head. Mud clung to her face. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her teeth were chattering from hypothermia she'd stopped noticing hours ago. Those belong to someone who doesn't exist anymore, she said. No. He knelt beside her, not caring about the mud, not caring about anything except the fact of her kneeling in front of her dead husband's grave. No, Mom. Those belonged to someone who saved that man's life last night. Those belonged to someone who was so good at what she does that she could lock a door and operate in a trauma bay and pull blood from a sack and keep a human being alive while she was being screamed at and threatened, and his voice broke. He steadied it. He sounded like his father. He sounded like every military officer she'd ever known, composed even when shattered. Those belong to you. He helped her to her feet. Her legs didn't work properly. They were made of something heavier than bone. But she stood anyway, because that's what you did when your son was holding military medals in a cardboard box in a graveyard at dawn. The hospital conference room at Oak Creek Memorial was full by noon the next day. The board president, legal counsel, department heads, administrators in their armor of blazers and careful expressions. The colonel's family in the back row, silent and watchful. Hargrove stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor who'd already won his case. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan's actions represent a fundamental breach of protocol, he was saying. An unauthorized procedure. Insubordination. And most concerning, a documented history of PTSD that she deliberately concealed from this institution. She is a liability. I recommend immediate revocation of her privileges pending a full psychological evaluation and permanent license review. The board president leaned back in her chair. She was about to speak when the conference room door opened. Brooke's son walked to the front of the room. He was still holding the shadow box. His hands were steady. He was 17 years old and standing in front of 12 institutional adults, and his hands did not shake. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, he said. Silence. The kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their electronic song. Hargrove scoffed. This is a desperate stunt. A nurse from the ICU stood up. Her name was Jennifer. She'd worked 3 units down from Brooke for 2 years without ever saying more than good morning. She opened a personnel file with trembling hands. 2 bronze stars, Jennifer read aloud, her voice shaking. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. The room shifted. Subtle. A collective intake of breath. A recalibration. She ran field hospitals under mortar fire in Ramadi, the boy continued. His voice was his mother's voice, level, measured, carrying the weight of fact. She performed 47 emergency pericardiocenteses in the field. Last night was number 48. Last night she saved a man who was supposed to die. The conference room door opened again. Boots on the tile floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. A Navy SEAL commander in full dress uniform, the kind that looked like it had been pressed by someone who understood that appearance was a form of respect. 2 officers flanked him. He looked directly at Hargrove the way you'd look at something you'd found on the sole of your shoe. Senior Chief Sullivan holds the Silver Star for running a trauma bay under enemy fire for 16 hours straight in Ramadi, he said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, constant, mechanical, utterly indifferent to the human reactions around it. She saved more lives in one deployment than you'll see in your entire career, Dr. Hargrove. She performed 47 emergency pericardiocenteses in the field, the commander continued. Successful outcomes on all 47. No complications. No deaths. She did it in conditions that would have made your best training look like a simulation. Last night was number 48. Your patient is alive because of her. Not in spite of your protocol. Because she violated it. An FBI liaison stepped forward. Female, dark suit, the kind of presence that suggested she'd walked into worse rooms than this and walked out unchanged. She also provided critical intelligence that led to the rescue of 14 hostages, including 2 American journalists and a congressman's daughter, the liaison said. Her location has been classified for her protection under federal witness security protocols. Dr. Hargrove, when you contacted her previous employers and requested her full employment history, when you revealed her current identity and location to multiple parties outside this institution, you compromised that protection. You compromised federal witness security. Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. That, the liaison continued, is a federal crime. You're facing charges. The board president stood. Slowly. The way you stand when you're realizing you've been standing on the wrong side of a line for a very long time. Dr. Hargrove, she said. Your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. The emergency board meeting at Oak Creek Memorial had been called for 9 a.m., and Dr. Hargrove had made sure every detail was arranged. Local news cameras lined the hallway outside the conference room. He'd invited them himself, wanted documentation of the dangerous deviations, the reckless insubordination, the nurse who'd threatened to destroy everything he'd built in 3 years of careful hierarchy construction. The board president sat at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by hospital administration, risk management, and a representative from the state nursing board. Hargrove occupied the chair directly across from where Brooke Sullivan would be terminated. He'd even prepared remarks. Dismissal letters sat in neat stacks, already signed by 4 of the 5 board members. But Brooke didn't sit down when security escorted her in. She stood at the back of the room, her presence like a stone dropped into still water, unremarkable on the surface, but the ripples had already begun. Her 17-year-old son walked forward. He was tall, with his mother's steady eyes and a posture that made the entire room shift. He approached the microphone positioned in front of the board table, and when he spoke, his voice didn't crack. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. The words hung there. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The news cameras zoomed in. A nurse from the ICU, the one who'd always nodded at Brooke in the break room but said nothing, stood and walked to the personnel file cabinet with trembling hands. She opened Brooke's original military folder, the one she deliberately buried under administrative records, the one marked classified, background investigation complete. She read aloud, 2 bronze stars. A Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one landed like a stone. The door at the back of the conference room opened. A Navy SEAL commander in full dress uniform entered, dress white so crisp they could cut glass, ribbons on his chest that told their own wars, medals stacked with the weight of 1,000 decisions made in darkness. He walked directly to where Hargrove sat and looked down at him with eyes like cold Atlantic water. Senior Chief Sullivan holds the Silver Star for running a trauma bay under enemy fire for 16 hours straight in Ramadi, and she saved more lives in one deployment than you'll see in your entire career. Hargrove stood. His hands were fists. His face was brick red, not with shame, but with the specific rage of a man who'd just realized his carefully arranged dominoes had been toppled by forces he couldn't control. An FBI liaison stepped forward next, adjusting a dark suit jacket with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when she arrived. She held a folder, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of federal authority that made state boards look like elementary school councils. She also provided critical intelligence that led to the rescue of 14 hostages, and her location has been classified for her protection, a protection you compromised by contacting her previous employers 3 states away and attempting to discredit her professional record to external agencies. Hargrove opened his mouth. The liaison's next words cut him off before his lips formed sound. That constitutes federal obstruction of a protected witness, interference with classified personnel matters, and weaponized defamation. The Justice Department is opening a formal investigation. The board president's face had gone pale. He'd been maneuvered. They all had. The news cameras captured everything, the lawyer from risk management putting his face in his hands, the state nursing board representative actually taking notes about Hargrove's conduct, not Brooke's. The board president turned directly to Hargrove, and when he spoke, his tone was administrative, which somehow made it worse than anger. You compromised a protected federal witness. You interfered with life-saving medical care. You weaponized institutional authority for personal vendetta. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Hargrove's face cycled through expressions like a broken film reel, denial, rage, and finally, comprehension. the specific comprehension of a man watching his entire infrastructure collapse in 60 seconds. Security arrived, and the final image the news cameras captured was Hargrove being escorted out the same exit they'd used with Brooke the day before, his badge deactivated, his credentials revoked, his future rapidly becoming a very small room with very limited options. The hospital board issued a formal public apology that afternoon. Within 72 hours, Brooke was offered her position back with a promotion to Director of Emergency Medicine. She accepted on one condition, that Oak Creek Memorial would establish a PTSD support program for healthcare workers, nurses and physicians who carried invisible wounds no one else could see. The board approved it unanimously. They would have approved anything at that point. Over the following weeks, Hargrove's cascade accelerated with the momentum of a system finally seeing him clearly. His wife filed for separation. The country club revoked his membership. Colleagues who'd laughed at his dismissal suddenly couldn't remember his number. His medical license was suspended pending formal review. News footage went viral, doctor fired for blocking war hero nurse, and the comments section became a graveyard where his reputation went to decompose. 6 months later, Brooke walked through a grocery store parking lot on a Tuesday morning. Her son was beside her, pushing the cart. They were buying groceries. It was ordinary. It was supposed to be ordinary. Then she saw it, a folding table near the entrance, a banner reading supplemental insurance, asked me how in faded red letters that looked like they'd been printed 5 years ago. Behind the table sat Hargrove. 20 pounds heavier. A suit that had been cheap when he bought it and hadn't improved with age. Eyes hollow like a building with all the lights turned off. He saw her. She saw him. For a moment, time stopped completely, the kind of pause that contains entire conversations, entire wars, entire lifetimes of what could have been said. Brooke didn't stop walking. She didn't hurry either. Her pace remained exactly the same. Her son started to say something, but she gently squeezed his shoulder, and he understood. You don't stop for this. You acknowledge it and you keep moving, because movement forward is the only dignity that matters. That evening, she returned to Oak Creek Memorial for a late shift. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and hope, the good kind of hope, the kind built on foundation rather than delusion. She stopped by the colonel's room. He was back for a follow-up appointment, and when she entered, she saw him sitting upright in the bed, healthy and strong, the kind of alive that cardiac tamponade patients don't usually get to be. On his bedside table, she placed something small, a pair of worn combat boots from Ramadi, the one she'd kept in her locker, the one she'd placed at her husband's grave months ago. The rubber was cracked. The leather had turned the color of old sand. They carried the weight of a woman's entire history. The colonel looked at them, then at her. His voice was rough from the breathing tube he no longer needed. Why these? Brooke sat on the edge of his bed, and when she spoke, her voice had the specific gravity of someone who'd learned what mattered and what didn't by watching both die. Because I don't need to carry them anymore. You do, to remember that giving up is a choice, and so is fighting. He nodded slowly. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. My husband told me once that true class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching. When there's no reward. She looked toward the window, toward the parking lot, toward the place where a man sat behind a folding table trying to convince strangers to buy insurance they didn't need. Dr. Hargrove did what he did in the light, for an audience, for power. You fought in the dark because it was right. That's the difference. Later that night, Brooke walked through the ICU, and this time when she entered the break room, nurses didn't leave. They made space. A younger nurse, maybe 24, nervous energy like electricity in her shoulders, asked her advice on a difficult patient. Dr. Chen, the visiting trauma surgeon who'd recognized her Kandahar splice months ago, brought her coffee the way she liked it. The camera of her life pulled back to show the hospital at night, lights glowing like a small city of healing, and her silhouette visible through the window as she worked. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever had to hide who you really are just to survive, if you've ever wondered whether fighting in silence counts as courage, like and subscribe for more stories about the warriors among us who wear scrubs instead of dress uniforms. Comment below, would you have walked past Hargrove, or would you have stopped?